Last session of the afternoon. So far today, you've had the chance to attend sessions on innovation, ESG investing, retirement income, and enrollment techniques, among some other things. But these are all important subjects as we continue to improve our retirement plans and try and provide better financial security for our participants. But another important aspect of providing security in retirement is to provide security of our participants' assets and personally identifiable information. Today, because of technology, we have more information at our fingertips than ever before. Of course, as you heard today, we probably don't use a lot of that information we do have at our fingertips, but or maybe not use it well. But unfortunately, the same technology has enabled people with bad intentions to access personal and financial data of almost everyone in this room. So as plan sponsors and those providing services to our plans, we're collectively responsible for billions, if not trillions, of dollars of our participants' retirement assets. And so we have a duty to protect those assets. And so to help us understand the cyber threats that we have now and those threats that we may have in the future, we have four expert panelists with me. The first one, to my immediate right, is Peggy Haering. And Peggy is Counsel and Assistant Director with Healthcare Policy and Benefit Services at the state of Connecticut. So welcome, Peggy.
Thank you.
Next to her, in the middle, we have Assunta Vivolo, and Assunta is Assistant Director in the Division of Enforcement Cyber Unit in the Philadelphia office of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And so you had a short trip, right?
Just a few blocks.
Okay. Next to her is Tim Rouse, and Tim is the Executive Director of the Spark Institute for Record Keepers. And last but not least, on the far end is Melanie Kolp. And Melanie is the Technology Executive leading Nationwide's retirement plan technology strategy. So we've got a really good group here to start us off on this session. And what I'm going to do, we're going to have a conversation and to talk about our cyber threats. But I want to just start off with some information, first of all. And so, as we start to consider cybersecurity, we want to look at what's behind it, who's behind it, and some of the breaches and some of the fraud. And so, some of the data we have is 73% of the breaches are perpetrated by outsiders. 28% involve internal actors, which is interesting. 2% involve partners. 50% of breaches were carried out by organized crime groups, and 12% of breaches involve actors identified as nation, state, or state affiliated. So what are other commonalities? 49% are non-point of service malware, which was installed via malicious email. 76% of breaches were financially motivated. 13% of breaches were motivated by the gain of strategic advantage, such as espionage. And 68% of breaches took months or longer to discover. Of the victims, and this was a little surprising to me, but 58% of the victims are categorized as small businesses. So it's not just the big players, the well-known, that are being impacted by cyber crimes. In terms of what tactics are utilized, 48% of the breaches feature hacking. 30% included malware. 17% of the breaches had errors as casual events. 17% were social attacks. 12% involved privilege misuse. 11% of breaches involve physical actions. And so that gives you an idea of some of the things that we're facing. And as you can see from that, there are a lot of different types of threats that we have to be aware of, and we have to try and avoid and mitigate. Before we actually get into some questions, though, what I want to do is ask you all, as you've been doing in some of the other sessions today, to answer a few polling questions. So if we could bring up the first question. I think that's being handled from back there, right? Here we go. So we'll see how this changes. Security is a top-of-the-mind concern for my business. So far, that's impressive. That's pretty good. I wouldn't have guessed it would have been that high. Okay, it looks like that's it. So 87% said that that's the case. So excellent. The next question. Plan sponsors only. Have any participants experienced an unauthorized distribution from your DC plan? So far, it looks like about 20% have said yes. 65% said no. That's good. 16% not sure. We're still getting a little change in it. And as we get into some of the discussion with the panelists, maybe we can see if that jives with some of your experience. Okay, next polling question. Has your record keeper modified plan distribution practices due to cyber threats or attempted fraud involving participant accounts? So it looks like quite a few are taking advantage of that and making those changes. Close to 60%. Tim, does that surprise you?
No, that doesn't surprise me.
Okay, next question. I think I've lost count. I think we might have one more. Okay, I or we currently have the necessary expertise in-house to address the cybersecurity concerns. So a little over 50% say yes. 34% say no, and 14% are not sure. So some work to be done there. Okay. Well, with that in mind, let me go on and ask some questions to our panelists to get a little more into what is happening in the cyber area. And I'm going to start out by asking a question to Tim. What kind of cyber threats are record keepers experiencing that you're seeing?
A lot of the cyber security threats traditionally have been to get personally identifiable information. But we've seen since the breaches, the infamous breaches with Equifax and with Target and others, a lot of the personally identifiable information is now out in the marketplace. And so what we've now started to experience is the use of that personally identifiable information to actually get access to individuals' accounts, which is obviously even more concerning.
Right. Assunta, could you describe what the cyber unit areas the SEC has and what subject matters they're concerned with at this time?
Sure thing. Before I start, I have to give the standard disclaimer for an SEC speaker, which is that the views I express today are my own and don't necessarily reflect those of the commission. So don't hold anything I say to go to the whole commission. But I am in the Division of Enforcement, and as we mentioned, I'm in the cyber unit, which was formed about a year ago at this point. Using expertise around the division that had already existed in the cyberspace, but really concentrating it because obviously it's an area of priority for the commission. What the unit focuses on, and this is again from an enforcement perspective, of course our Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations may have slightly different focal points. But we focus on 3 general areas. One is trading, and what I mean by that is really hacking to trade. So there are individuals out there who are hacking to look for material non-public information in order to trade. Account intrusions and takeovers, which is a very common thing that we're seeing more of, where individuals are able to go into accounts in order to try and drain the assets or use it to do other types of manipulative trading. So actually take over an account of an individual and then try to engage in wash trades or other types of manipulative trading without that person even knowing it's going on, of course. And then there are manipulations via all sorts of electronic platforms. And what we mean by that is there are a ton of fake websites out there which are asking individuals to to send money. It happens quite a bit. It's the internet version, the upgrade to the Nigerian prince, I like to call it. It's a whole website now, and it's much more sophisticated. A lot of it is actually coming from Nigeria. That is sort of a joke, but not really. So there are a lot of fake websites out there. And anyway, so those are the 3 trading types. Of course, you've all heard a lot about ICOs and other types of cyber assets and digital assets, which is a very common. Digital currency issues are really top priority for the Commission, and we've taken a step to be out in front on those issues. And then lastly, what's probably most important to everyone in this room are cybersecurity breaches and what regulated entities and public issuers do in response to those breaches, and also their disclosures around it.
Okay. So I have to disclose that these are my questions and do not represent the position of NAGDCA.
That's fair.
So back to you, though. What are the regulated entities that the SEC oversees, and what is the SEC's general approach to cybersecurity-related controls?
Sure. So as you might imagine, there are really 3 categories of regulated entities that the Commission looks to in terms of specific entities that are registered with the Commission. That would be broker-dealers, registered investment advisors, and investment companies. There are obviously additional issues regarding public companies and their disclosures, but that's a separate issue. And there are also exchange rules regarding national exchanges and what cybersecurity steps they need to take. But for purposes of today, I think it's really the regulated entities that is of most interest. And there are 2 rules with regard to regulated entities that the Commission enforces. One is Reg SP, which is a regulation requiring that registered entities, the 3 categories I just described, have appropriate policies and procedures in place to safeguard customer information. And the second is Reg SID, which also requires those same entities to safeguard PII, as you were talking about. I think, not to give away the store, but there are going to be some cases coming in the near future where you'll see where the Enforcement Division comes out on those specific issues and what is required. The cases that have come out to date have been pretty egregious, and I think the Commission's view is that we are not out to play gotcha. That's not what is really the focus of the Commission. It's looking for, in the egregious cases, no policies and procedures, no safeguards in place to protect those assets or protect the customer identification and information. So that's really where we fall in that.
Okay, thank you. This is probably directed more at both Tim and Melanie, but I understand that almost every state has its own data breach notification laws. Most plans have retired participants in multiple states, so how do record keepers address compliance with the various laws and definitions of a breach?
Is it for me? No.
Either one.
You want to go first? Okay. Okay, so yes, there are definitely a whole set of laws and regulations, both at the top of the house, kind of national level, and then as well as individual states. So we record keepers usually have specific sets of lawyers and compliance officers that are trained and are very specific in understanding what those different laws and regulations are so that we can understand how to have specific practices and processes in place that are specific to that particular state. So there's a lot of kind of regular, what I'll just call across the board sort of securities practices that we put in place, and then very specific based on those individual legislations.
So I'll take that to sort of the next level up. And as an industry association, we began the Data Security Oversight Board about 3 years ago now. And the board is made up of record keepers and plan consultants. One of the things that we had done, and Keith is on that committee, we created some standards for cybersecurity. We've now started to take it to another level. We've created a retirement industry council that we work with FSISAC in terms of sharing information back and forth, but we're also started and that's to your question, Keith, about the breach issue. Mm-hmm. Well, what is a breach? And that's become a big issue with us, and so we're trying to work on, from an industry perspective on definitions. Because does a breach involve getting through 2 levels of 15 levels of firewall? If that's the case, then you would probably be inundated every night with notices. And so we're trying to come up with something that becomes a meaningful standard. Because if you're being inundated every night with hundreds and hundreds of notifications, it becomes the boy that cried wolf, and then eventually you start to ignore those. And then when a real breach happens, you get, later on you find out about it, and then you ask, well, why didn't I know about it? Well, you did. You got notified a month ago. And so we want it to be really meaningful. So we've been, as a board, trying to create some common understanding of what is a breach, what is an incident. We actually submitted some comments to the Financial Stability Board, which is an international organization, to try to come up with some of those agreed upon terms as well.
Okay. Well, are there any, Tim, are there any new privacy laws that we should be aware of? And one I'm thinking of is the European Union's General Data Protection Regulations that could apply to U.S. companies?
Well, so the privacy laws are happening all over the place, and I'm sure that you guys are starting to look at that as well. So Europe has taken the lead on it, and back in May they came out with the GDPR rules. California has now come out with some rules, and I believe 6 other states are also creating privacy regulations. It certainly is an area now of key concern for our industry members, and that is more and more plan sponsors are looking for better and better services to their participant base. But with that comes issues around privacy and what can be used and what can't be used in order to provide services to participants. So it's an area of big focus for us right now.
Okay. Now this could really be a question for any of our panelists here, but does only the record keeper have responsibility for protecting participant data and information, or how do we deal with that issue? Since we have both plan sponsors and record keepers here?
Well, obviously, the plan sponsor is sharing census data with the record keeper. So, the record keeper is getting from the plan sponsor a feed of all of, the most sensitive, personally identifiable information. So obviously, the record keeper has got to protect its end of the transaction. So our internal processes have to be as bulletproof as we can make them.
Yeah, I think from a record keeper perspective, and I think what's important to note is there used to be sort of this theory that cyber was a IT problem or a technology problem, and then maybe it's a record keeper problem, but it's really about everybody that has access and has any sort of attachment to that plan. So whether it's a plan sponsor, the record keeper, an administrator, consultant, et cetera. So because if you saw from those stats that Keith shared earlier, the biggest or the most frequent type of attack is through malicious emails, and anybody can click on one of those emails and get access into a system, et cetera. So, and it's not just that one underlying system that may hold the data. You even actually mentioned the Target breach from a few years ago, and that Target breach was actually someone got into the HVAC company's system and then made their way into Target through the HVAC company. So it's a whole lot of pieces put together. And we have to be very diligent about how do we ensure that not only from a record keeper perspective that we're following all the laws and regulations and have our frameworks and guidelines in place for how we protect data, but then also most importantly as well how we respond to an incident if one does occur. But we also need to ensure that every piece that touches, whether it's back to the plan sponsor through information transfers, or through any type of third party, that those same types of controls are in place, that the diligence and the importance has been placed on the security of that data, because any place in that chain something could break down and we could have a problem.
So plenty of holes to plug in the dike, sounds like.
Yeah.
Tim, you mentioned the Data Security Oversight Board, so if you could talk a little bit about what Spark has been doing along those lines to assist both record keepers and then therefore their clients.
It's actually been a great group working together very closely. The consultant community actively engaged with the record keepers for the benefit of both parties, because the record keepers understand instantly that you as a plan sponsor need to know that these records are protected and that they're secure. At the same time, in the process of trying to evaluate a record keeper, record keepers need to maintain a certain level of privacy. And if during an RFP process or a search process, you're answering a bunch of questions that are of such an intimate detail that it ends up becoming a roadmap for the hackers that gets out into the internet and becomes really a roadmap into systems, that's not a benefit to anyone. And so we brought together this Data Security Oversight Board to really kind of identify, well, what is it that plan sponsors need to know, and then how do we go about communicating to them in a proper way. And what we did was we looked at all of the questions that had been asked by consultants and plan sponsors over the years, and we had totaled them up to something like 1,500. Yeah, there was a lot. And as we looked at them, we started to say, well, what is this question actually trying to answer? Okay, well, this question was looking at physical plant security, and this question was looking at cloud security, and this question was looking at passport protection, and so on and so forth. And we individually put every one of the questions into a bucket. And then we ended up at the end of that process finding that we had 16 different buckets. These were all of the 16 things that plan sponsors were routinely focused on. Then we said, well, historically what's been happening is that record keepers would respond to these questions via an RFP process, and they would just provide you an answer. That answer was just what their sales team or whoever was developing as a response to that. And as we took a step back, and the consultant community said, well, we want to make sure that these answers are accurate, and we understand that we're not going to get access to behind the firewall. We're not going to be in there being able to do penetration testing and other types of things. So, but we don't want to rely simply on the word of the record keeper. So we employed the services of the third-party auditors that are already in there today, doing audits. So the Pricewaterhouses and the Deloittes and others of the world who are now doing those audits today for management. We took those 16 and we had them apply those 16 to a simplified report that could now come out, and it's not graded by us. It's not approved or signed off by us. It simply says these are the controls that have been put in place. These are how the controls were tested, and these are the test results. From there, you or your consultant can now easily evaluate on an apples-to-apples basis which firms are doing the right things and which firms are not doing the right things based on the evaluation of that report. So we tried to standardize it to make it easier. And now we're taking that report, because it's now being rapidly adapted or adopted in the industry today. And we're taking it now to the next level of all of the third-party administrators that are also touching PII.
Okay. Well, from your perspective, and maybe Melanie, from yours, is also from a record keeper, is it common for the record keepers to have independent evaluations of their controls to counter cyber attacks and related fraud? And if so, what can be done?
Yeah, so there are several frameworks that you can follow in the industry. Outside of, there's a set of regulations and laws that are required. There's also sets of frameworks that you can follow outside of the one that what Tim was talking about that are all around standard practices and processes within the cyber and data security. So it's important to know if your record keeper has one of those frameworks in place and is following them. Now that the Spark framework's in place, that's obviously a great other resource to know. What your record keeper is doing when it comes to cybersecurity and protecting personally identifiable information. And there's also, when it comes to fraud, there's not quite the same type of laws and regulations about how you protect from fraud, but there's great general best practices that are put in place, ways to protect not only from fraud through the internet, which is what most people kind of jump to, but there's phone fraud, there's mail, US mail fraud. And so you can ask questions about, from your record keeper, what are they doing? What kind of practices do they have in place? What type of technology are they using to help protect their participants' accounts from fraudulent attacks as well as cyber-related attacks?
And one of the things, Keith, that we did when we developed the communication standards or the best practices, we started down a path of trying to identify a framework. But what we found is, to Melanie's point, is that some companies might use NIST, others might use ISO, others might use high trust, others might use a custom framework. And they all use those frameworks for their own internal reasons. And so there was really no way that we could get everybody on the same framework. So we actually took a step back and we said, well, really what we want to be is framework agnostic. And that's what we've done with our reporting, our standardized reporting. It doesn't matter which framework you use, because you're all going to, the individual record keeper will use the framework that that's most beneficial or most efficient for them. But what it does do is require you to identify the framework, and then it requires you to still go through the 16 buckets. So, and it's actually better because flexibility is better than focusing in on, if it was mandated that everyone use the same framework, well then the bad guys would only have one thing that they would have to crack into. So it's actually good to have a diversity of frameworks that are applied.
Okay, good. Peggy, from a plan sponsor perspective, what processes can we put in place now to prevent unauthorized distributions from DC plan accounts?
Well, I think the main thing you have to do is work with your record keeper and find out exactly what processes a record keeper is using to prevent unauthorized distributions. And that requires, so in the case of one area of particular vulnerability is the first time a participant sets up an online access to their account. And all they usually need is their social security number and some name, address, and age, date of birth. So what happened in the past is someone could get online access and request a distribution that same day. That process has now been modified to require a verification code be sent to the participant's home address, so that no transactions can take place in the account until the participant has verified that, in fact, he or she was the one that just entered the online access. So that's one of the things that we're doing. I think awareness is critical. I think some of the record keepers have put into place processes to verify that the bank accounts where distributions are being sent are actually owned by the participant. I've learned that there's a rash of fraudulent account establishments at banks. So our record keeper has a list of bad banks now. So, I mean, it's gotten to the point where I think you have to look at every step along the way, and the record keeper has to be able to hold up distribution processing and where something seems sketchy, And we've had a lot of instances where fraudsters have tried to get distributions from our accounts. So I think the main thing to keep in mind is it's a very fluid situation. It's always changing. These people are really determined and smart. And especially with public plans, there's so much information out there. Freedom of Information Act can result in somebody getting a list of all your employees. They can see who are the high payers, who have the high salaries, and they can target them. So, it seems like every few months we get a new attack that is different and a little bit more sophisticated. So I think the whole thing is the record keeper has to keep changing the practices. There's multi-factor authentication where they'll send you a code to get into your account. That's another thing you can do, is attach your cell phone number to an account. So if somebody goes into your account, no transactions can take place until you send back a code. So anything that would slow down a transaction, I think, is where we need to go right now.
Unfortunately, some of that has to do with not providing the convenience you'd like to some of your participants.
Right, but I mean, who would care? If your account balance is 0 tomorrow, you're not gonna be the one that's complaining.
Yeah.
You can't have that.
Yeah, Keith, that's where exactly I was going to go, is we have these conversations about that protection, and when you think about millennials coming up and being that next set of retirees, planning for their retirement, they expect that quick, I want a distribution, I want to go online, and I want a distribution, I want the money in my account. And when you do that, that takes out all of the record keepers' ability to have more significant checks in place. So right now, for example, we hold a distribution for 24 hours because there are checks, just as Peggy was mentioning. Is the name on the account the same as the bank account? Have we checked, any unusual transactions? So there is a hold for 24 hours, which gives us time to be able to react to a strange instance or something that doesn't feel right or look right. But when you start thinking about what that next generation is going to expect, it gets scarier for how are we going to make sure we can get in a really short period of time the same level of diligence around those precautions, so that we know that that money coming out of their retirement account is actually going to the person it was intended for. It's a balance.
Well, unfortunately, in some cases, despite all of those things we're trying to do to prevent the fraud, it does happen. In that case, do record keepers have written response plans to guide their actions in the event of a successful cyber attack or fraudulent event?
Most firms, and each firm has their own particular procedures for how they handle fraud. And as far as I am aware, they all have procedures for if a fraud occurs. I know it begins typically with an investigation of the fraud. As I mentioned earlier, we've created the Retirement Industry Council under the FSISAC umbrella, and so there's a sister organization called Multi-State, which is for the governmental entities. And what it allows member firms to do is to share information on a confidential basis. And we set this up because the FSISAC has been in existence for a long time, but a lot of the types of fraud activity that was going into it, a lot of times were bank machine fraud or credit card fraud, and didn't really involve the retirement industry. So what we wanted to do was create this Retirement Industry Council so that our member firms could share information on a confidential basis that we've experienced this particular type of an attack. We've experienced this particular type of fraud. We know that the bad guys are working together. You saw the numbers earlier that 50% of the attacks Keith showed are happening through organized crime. There's entities out there, their whole purpose for existing is to find bugs in various programs, security programs. Once they find the bugs, they sell them to someone else who typically is utilizing those bugs to gain access to personally identifiable information. Those folks then take that information and then sell it to someone else who's then using it to actually get to the assets in a participant's accounts. So the bad guys are working together, and so it was really incumbent on us to begin to start to work together, and that's what the Retirement Industry Council does. It now allows member firms to share that information, and then we're trying to take it to the next level which is our next project, to begin to start to work on risk metrics, so that member firms can then see, okay, where is the threat? I may have not been hit today, but looking out into the future, where might I expect to be hit based on what's happening among other firms? And that's the next sort of level of what we're trying to accomplish.
So what type of questions should plan sponsors be asking current or potential record keepers about their cybersecurity practices?
So I can start, and then I'm sure Timmy might have some ideas as well. So one of the biggest things to ask is, does your record keeper follow a particular framework? And again, like Tim mentioned, it doesn't necessarily matter which one, but do they follow one? So do they have those standards, processes, and practices in place? I'd also ask them about incident management. So when there is something that happens, so like we said, it's going to happen. We're not, there's no bulletproof answer here. There's no way to ensure that there will never be an attempt on any company. But so how do we know that the practices are in place to respond to an event, to make sure that any type of attack can be shut down before there's any great damage that could be caused? And how do we know how you're getting communicated to if the event of either a fraud or any type of cyber incident would occur within that record keeper? So asking those types of questions about what practices they follow, and also how do they handle an event if one does occur, I think are two very important things to understand about your record keeper.
And what I would add is, are you using the Spark security standards? That is, and it was never intended to be the be-all and end-all by any means. What it's intended to do is create a baseline for you. Rather than asking 1,500 questions. And what we found, interestingly enough, what we found is that member firms were getting asked these questions, and yet they were never getting follow-up questions, which kind of gets to the underlying. It's a very complicated area. It's an area that really requires specialty understanding. And what this was, creating the standards was mutually beneficial for both the retirement record keepers as well as the plan sponsor and the plan consultants, because it gave us a common language to speak from. If you look at the Spark report, and you now have a Spark report for all of the vendors that you potentially could be evaluating, you again have a means of comparing one to the other. But it doesn't mean that that's where your questioning would stop. But what it allows you to do is hone in on areas of concern. So if you find that this particular vendor might seem to be deficient in category 7, then you're going to ask specific questions about category 7 versus another one who might be deficient in another category. So it really gives you the basis of intelligently diving into what individual firms are doing.
I think it's also important to ask, in the event of a fraud, will your record keeper make your participants whole? And I think that's, right now, that seems to be the standard practice. But I've seen the fidelity guidelines around cybersecurity, and there seems to be some question if the participant is deemed responsible for putting his or her information out there, then there may not be coverage. So I think it's a good thing to establish up front who's responsible if there is an unauthorized distribution.
We're talking about responsibility as well. Do any of you have experience with cyber insurance, and is there anything you can share with the audience regarding the value or the cost of cyber insurance?
I do not.
Well, I can take that. One of the ancillary benefits that we saw to the Spark report was and we've started to engage with a few of the larger insurance companies around that, was that potentially, and it wasn't by any means the primary goal, but it was sort of this ancillary benefit of allowing the insurance providers to be able to better evaluate you for cyber insurance. But cyber insurance is very complicated. Under what situations will they cover a breach, and what is a breach? Definitions are not really well defined. So that's an area where we're hoping that the stuff that we're doing from an industry perspective will help make that an easier process, both for our members as well as for the insurance providers.
From my experience, one thing I found out about cyber insurance that it's a value too. Melanie indicated earlier that Nationwide has a lot of attorneys that do help them with all these various state laws. If there is some kind of event, how do you have to respond to that legally? And one of the things I found out about cyber insurance is that they can often provide that service for you too, to make sure that you are complying with every state law and doing the proper notification. So beyond that too, what and I don't know, maybe Assunta, you have some ideas on this as well, but what resources are available to plan sponsors to help them understand the best ways to protect data? And I'll open it up to any of you if you have any thoughts on that.
I think there's a wealth of information out there. I think the 2016 ERISA conference on cybersecurity provided a lot of really great resources. And so even though public plans aren't ERISA plans, there was a list of just about everything. There was a list of questions that you should be asking. And it was a really great place to start. It's a great place to start. And I think there's a lot of great articles out there. I think the Spark materials are terrific. The next time you issue an RFP, I think there's a bunch of questions you should be asking, and I think there's a lot of great references out there already.
And I think what's important is there's a whole range of what you can get help with, from just doing a search on the internet and finding information to going specifically to Spark and getting that information. There's also companies that can help, external companies that specialize in data security and privacy, et cetera. So you can hire a company that can do an attack and penetration test. Nationwide, for example, does that every year and has a third-party company attempt to hack into the systems so that we can see if we have any vulnerabilities and find them ourselves before somebody else does. But so there's specialized companies that do that for physical security, to see if someone can access your building, to all different types of ways that you can get help through others that are much more experienced in that space than all of us are. Kind of in our own little world, we don't know how broad those different types of attacks can be. So the biggest thing we always try to encourage people is to ask for help, and don't assume that just one person or a couple of people in your IT department know enough to be able to cover every aspect of what could be coming.
One of the areas that we're working on, and our group is very collegial in the way they work together, even though they're competitors. They work together very effectively, and each of them it's made up of the chief information security officers, the chief risk officers of member firms, and they recognized almost immediately from day one that if by working together, they're really benefiting themselves, because a breach of any one of them is reputational damage to the entire industry. And so this idea of sharing information is very important among them. What we're looking at is how can we reinforce the entire chain? And we talked earlier, and Peggy mentioned earlier, that you have to look at the data that comes from your individual members, and then from and some states have various other communities, not just the state, but maybe towns and cities that are part of their plan. And all along that entire chain, we have to make sure that it's reinforced and strong, because that's wherever that weakest link is where the attacks are going to be. So we've now started to look at how can we help, and this is for a lot of private employers, how can we help those small employers that don't necessarily have the technical resources that large corporations or even large governments have. And so we've started to work with Verizon and other organizations that do cybersecurity to try to figure out how we can provide services to smaller employers that might not have the same technical capabilities.
Okay. We know from the conversation, I think it's obvious that this isn't just an IT issue. There are a lot of elements to it. And I think that plan sponsors need to look at this as being part of their due diligence. So you should have these conversations with your vendors, know what's going on, and also you need to be thinking about and probably going back and just looking and making sure that you've got clarification on these kinds of issues in your vendor contracts.
I think you also have to give your participants a wake-up call.
Yeah.
Look at your statements every so often. Don't read your emails. Don't put things off, because I think that was a big issue for some of our participants, is they don't check their statements that often.
Yeah. And probably communicating with participants too, to make sure that they're aware of some of the cyber threats and what they can do on their part to help alleviate that, because that's another area of potential weakness. Well, we want to make sure that we do have some time for questions, and we have a number of questions here that have come up. So before we go into those, though, I just want to thank all of the 4 panelists for their expertise and for willing to be here to talk about this critical issue. So let's give them a round of applause. So we have quite a few questions. I doubt that we'll get through all of them, but a couple of them starting off having to do with cyber insurance. Would like to know more about the cybersecurity insurance products. I don't know if anybody else has any other things other than what we had talked about already about. I will say this, having purchased cyber insurance for several years now, we just got a new quote for it, and we did see a substantial reduction in premiums. So that's a good sign, and I'm assuming that's because there are more products out there and more people searching for this now, but that was something that just came up that was a good sign for us. But I think, again, it's not just the insurance that helps you in the event of the high cost of dealing with, say, a breach, but also having that expertise. And I know in our case, they actually evaluated our response plan and some of our internal controls. Obviously, if they're going to insure us, they want to make sure that we're doing what we should be doing. So there are several different benefits to having the insurance. Another question related to that: who would purchase the cyber security insurance, the plan sponsor or TPA?
I would suspect that both might have individual policies. Because it really, I think at the end of the day, and this gets into the complicated nature of the relationship, is where did the breach occur? And so I think both entities might end up having cybersecurity insurance.
The record keeper could also have insurance as well. So.
Okay. Assunta, this is directed to you. Does the SEC rules apply to CITs, collective investment trusts? Does the SEC review cybersecurity for CITs?
I think it only applies to, the regulations only apply to entities that are registered with the commission that I outlined before, and I didn't catch the second part of the question.
Does the SEC review cybersecurity for CITs?
I think the answer to that is no. I don't know for certain, but I don't think so.
Next one, back to cyber insurance. Cyber attack insurance. How much insurance coverage should plans with $15 billion in assets have?
No clue.
How much
This is
can
going to be
they
a topic
get?
for your next NAGDCA conference.
I do believe that there may be a 10-to-1 ratio between deductible and how much insurance they will provide, though. Identity theft plays a huge role on cyber security threat for plan sponsors. Would like to know what record keepers are doing to help protect from fraudsters. You know, I think we've talked about some of that already. I don't know if there's anything else we have to add.
I can tell you that member firms, and we at our last conference in June, we had a lot of the new emerging technology firms in, who are looking at biometrics. They're looking at voice prints. There are other ways, since all of your data now is out there, or your name, address, birth, date of birth, social security number, all of those things that were traditionally the ways that we identified who you are no longer valid or no longer safe. So now a lot of firms have been utilizing a lot of the new biometrics. There's one firm that had come to our one firm who would come to our sessions in June uses, it's called BioCatch, and it's using a bunch of behavioral aspects to determine if the call or the caller is a fraudulent person. So there's a lot of investments in technology to protect against that.
That voice recognition, I think, is really important on the call center side. The other thing that I think record keepers in general are trying to look at is, instead of the normal security questions, that would be information you can find online. So even things you could get easily through social media, like what's your dog's name, or what is, you know, your mother's maiden name, those types of things. I know questions that are now being asked are things that are very specific to their retirement account. So when's the last time you made a beneficiary change? Or when is the last time you changed your distribution or took a loan? Or the last repayment you made on a loan. So kind of very specific to that person's account. Because if I'm just a bad actor and out on the internet, I'm not going to get that type of information until I get access to their retirement account. So that allows us to put some extra precautions in place by asking those right level of detailed questions.
Okay, good. Now we have 3 interrelated questions. How do you know the difference between a breach and identity theft? Does the number of people affected delineate? And without insurance, how would a plan sponsor keep these participants or make these participants whole? Any thoughts on that? Difference between a breach and identity theft.
Well, I think the perfect example is someone having a participant's PII and, trying to get into their account. So that's not necessarily the result of a breach within your plan. There's been a breach someplace else. I mean, we've had the Anthem breach, the Equifax breach. So those are usually individualized events where somebody is specifically trying to access an account, and then a breach when somehow somebody managed to get hold of the whole remittance file and grab the data for 50,000 people. That would be a breach.
I think, Keith, that under the umbrella of what a breach is, obviously identity theft is a type of breach. Account takeover is another type of breach where they've gotten access to your accounts and they've wired the money to a Cayman Island account. That's another type of breach. Ransomware is another type of breach. So there's all types of breaches. But back to my earlier comment about the need for definitions, a lot of plan sponsors are coming back to our members and embedding in contracts that they need to be notified of a breach, and then we have to determine, well, is it a breach just of your plan, or is it I would think, maybe sometimes you want to know, like, okay, well, another plan's been breached. So that terminology is being hammered out now, and it's really kind of the reason that it's a big focus for our members.
Yeah.
Well, the state statutes also define what a breach is, and they decide what an incident is, and then what the notice requirements are that go with that particular event. So it can change, but I think
But then the definition of breach from one state to another might be different.
it might change, yeah.
Well, the other part of that question was, making participants whole, and I think that's something you need to probably have a conversation as a plan sponsor with your record keeper, and make sure that you understand what those responsibilities are, and have those spelled out in your contracts.
Right.
Does Spark have a white paper or other general document that discusses the 16 items available online, Tim?
Yes, we do. On our website, we have our best practices available with the 16, and also what the scope is too. So you identify what the scope of the audit is, the audit report, what are the 16 categories, and so that's available.
Does Spark have model cybersecurity language for plan record-keeping contracts?
No, we don't, but it probably might be another project to consider for our Data Security Oversight Board.
What are some ways that are being used to verify a legitimate bank or bank account number?
So I don't know about the actual bank account number, but I mentioned earlier there's actually a process that's called early warning that a lot of the big global banks are now part of with record keepers and even other industry, other types of industries besides just retirement plans, where there's a verification step before any sort of ACH or wire or any type of money is going out from a retirement account. It will validate the name on the retirement account matches the name on the bank account. And if there are any discrepancies in those two names, then it'll end the transaction immediately and will not allow that to continue. You can also set up other parameters where it can't go to a bank account outside of the US, for example, or it can't go to certain countries, maybe not every country, but certain countries we'd be more concerned about than others. So there's quite a lot of interesting work that's been done to help protect money going out into a bank account that may not be what was intended, but I don't know about the validating an actual bank account number.
I know that there is, to what Melanie just mentioned, verification processes. Not all banks, most of the large banks are, but not all the banks necessarily participate in that program, so it's not 100%.
What are the standard delay times for banks or address changes before a distribution is made?
I think that's the record keeper's process, and I think that's that's something that the plan sponsor needs to discuss with the record keeper, because changes of that nature followed by distributions could create a problem. In the case of our plan, when we were under fraud attacks, the bad guys were stopping the mail of the participants whose attacks they were targeting. So if the process was you had to hear back from the participant, you wouldn't hear back before distribution. So
I don't know if anybody has the answer to this, but what's the annual dollar value that actually gets lost due to cyber attacks? Is it getting higher or lower? I think I know the answer to the last one.
The answer is getting higher.
Getting higher. I know the Equifax breach is well up over $500 million that one particular breach has cost that company. So that gives you an idea of how big it could be when you put all of the cyber attacks. I don't have a number, but that's just one.
All right. Well, we're coming to the end of our time on this, so there were great discussion from the panel and a lot of great questions from the audience too, so we appreciate all of that. And once again, let's thank the panelists for their input. You know, unfortunately, this is not a positive way to end the day on talking about cybercrime, but there is something else coming up that is much more positive, and that's the Quiz Bowl. So if you haven't seen that, please check in and see what's going on with the Quiz Bowl. And thank you for your participation today, and have a good evening.
Great job.